While TypeScript is providing some really powerful utility types already, some of them, which I would really like TypeScript to have, are still missing. So let's create one of these types ourselves today. Let's create the tuple utility type. So what is a tuple? First, let's create one in TypeScript, how we can do this. So let's say we have an RGB tuple here, and this is now an array, and we want to say this is allowed to have 3 elements in it. So a tuple basically is a fixed length array. So if I say here RGB tuple as an object like this, and I have 1, 2, 3 like this in there, then this is perfectly fine. But as soon as I add too many elements in there, we will get an error because it's only allowed to have 3 elements. Now, if I remove one, we can see I get an error too because we have 2 less arguments in there, 2 less objects. Now, the problem with this approach is that we can still say RGB tuple push, and we can see here we can add elements, but we can also remove elements by using pop. Now, to fix this, we can use read only here, and now we can see we no longer have access to these methods. Now, this is fine for normal simple tuples, but how would it look like when we would say we want to allow 3 or 4 elements? Then what we would have to do is basically copy this and say read only 3 or 4 elements like this, or we could say we would just replace this read only wrapper type here, and we can then also remove this read only and wrap this like this. And now we could use 3 or 4 elements easily. But the problem still is not really solved, because let's say you want to have 3, 4, or 5 elements. Or if you want to, for example, have a tuple which allows exactly 11 elements in there, then you would have the problem that you would have to count them manually yourself, and maybe you forget to add one element and it's really error prone. So wouldn't it be nice if TypeScript would provide such a type? Well, as already mentioned, TypeScript doesn't provide such a type, so let's help TypeScript a little bit and create this type ourselves. So how do we want this type to look like? Well, basically, we want to have a generic tuple type, which takes 2 arguments. The first one should be how many elements are allowed in there, so in this case 3. And the second one should be the type we want to allow, or the types. Let's here go easy with numbers so that we have like our RGB tuple which we want to have. Now, how could we implement this? We have already worked with recursion in our previous videos, and we will now continue to work with them. So we have our type here, let's call this type tuple. Now the first argument is the length property we will pass in there, the length type basically. The second one is the type we want to allow, in this case number. And now, because we don't pass in an existing type, because we create a new one, we need to have something like a collector or an accumulator. In our case here, this would be an array which we put in our types we want to allow. So what we have to do is we have to add a third argument here, and let's call this for accumulator. And then what we have to say is we say extends array like this. And what has to be in this array? Well, we only want type in there. So we want to have an array of types basically, because this is how you can specify that you only want to allow these types here, so the number, in this array. So we will store them in there. Currently, we would have to add an empty array everywhere we use this type, but we don't want to, of course. So what we can do is we can say equals empty array. So to start with, we will just say at first, this is just an empty array, and we will fill it later. Now let's add equals and let's fill this tuple type here. Now, the first thing we always have to do by using recursion is how we want to break out of this recursive loop. Now we can do this easily. We say, okay, when the length we have, we pass in our case, a 3, extends the length of this array we've built, because at first we have like an array which has no elements, and then we add one element, then a second one, and so on. And as soon as the length of this array is the length we pass in, we want to stop recursively calling. Now, how can we do this? We can just access the length of this type by using length. And because this is an array type, we have the possibility to do this, and it will return the real length. So we can say here, if the length extends the length of the array, in this case, we just want to return our accumulated array. Otherwise, what we want to do is we just call tuple again, and we pass in the length, the existing type. And now we want to add another element to this array. So how can we do this? We just say we create a new array here, spread our existing elements into it, and add one new type to it. And now we can see here line 3 and 5 are compiling. So let's check what the type here is. And we can see now that we get a fixed length array, a tuple basically, back with 3 elements in there. So if I change this 3 here to 4, we can see it changed from 3 to 4. Now only 4 elements are allowed in there, and if we have less, we get an error on line 5. But as already mentioned, we can make this also much more generic. We can say I want to have 3 or 4 elements in there. So as you can see, it created a type which allows 3 numbers or 4 numbers in there. But we could also say we want to have numbers or strings. So this makes it really easy to create really long tuples even. So you can go as far as 999, but as soon as you change this to 1000, then you will get a compile time error because TypeScript tells you maybe you are doing something wrong because this could easily be an endless recursive call. So of course, if you have like 1000 elements in a tuple, then maybe you should check your code. But let's go back to 3 here. And now we can see the only thing which is missing is this read-only we had, right? So what we could do to fix this is we just wrap our accumulator in a read-only type like this. And we can see now we have a read-only type with 3 elements. And of course, if I would now say it's 3 or 4 elements, then we could see here that it creates this read-only for both possible combinations of 3 or 4 elements. So by using this approach, you can really easily create really large and complex tuples without having to create them manually. So it's way less error prone if you let TypeScript do this for you, especially because you can immediately recognize how many elements are in this tuple. And I really like this approach. So thank you for watching the video. Let me know what you think about this approach in the comments, and I will see you soon in the next one.